The studio was colder than it looked on television, though the lights were hot enough to sting his skin. Julian Brenner sat beneath them, every inch of him polished perfection. Dark navy suit, silver tie knot precise. His expression crafted for the cameras with the same precision he used when designing software that would change the world. To the millions watching from their living rooms, he looked untouchable, confident. A man whose word could move markets and whose vision could reshape industries. But behind his eyes, hidden by layers of control and pride, a storm had begun to form, one that would destroy the fortress he'd built around himself for years. Patricia Huang, the sharpest interviewer in the country, sat across from him. Her eyes were not cruel, but they were mercilessly clear. The eyes of someone who had spent her entire career peeling masks from men who swore they didn't wear any. The red light blinked on the camera, and her first question struck with a softness that made it more lethal. "Mr. Brenner," she began, "before we discuss your company's innovations, I think our viewers deserve clarity on a personal matter. Multiple sources claim you have a daughter, 6 years old, named Helifera Brenner. Is this true?" For a split second, the air seemed to freeze. Julian's throat tightened. He could hear his father's voice in his head, the man who had built the family name from old money and relentless discipline, warning him that one mistake could collapse everything. He could see the investors' faces, could imagine the stock market reacting like a living beast to even the faintest whiff of scandal. He thought of Vivian Ashford, the woman by his side at every charity gala, every red carpet, the one who had told him point blank that she would not be with a man who carried domestic baggage. The silence stretched. Millions watched him hesitate. Then he smiled. The same smile that had convinced governments to sign billion-dollar contracts. The same smile that had made people trust him implicitly. "Patricia," he said smoothly, his tone easy and practiced, "I understand that in the world of fame there are always rumors. People invent stories, twist facts, seek attention, but I assure you I have no children. The reports are false." The lie rolled out effortlessly, almost elegantly, but it didn't feel elegant to him. It felt like swallowing glass across the city. In a small apartment far removed from the glittering skyline that bore his company's name, a little girl sat cross-legged on a faded carpet, her wide green eyes fixed on the television. Her name was Helifera, though everyone called her Helly. The TV screen reflected in her tear-bright eyes as her small fingers clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit. She didn't understand all the words, but she knew the face on the screen. She knew that voice. She had drawn it 100 times in crayon and taped it to the walls. That was her father, her hero, her entire world. And now, on live television, he had said she didn't exist. Her nanny, Mrs. Chen, stood frozen behind her, one hand over her mouth. "Oh, my poor girl," she whispered, but Helly didn't answer. She stood, trembling, and whispered the words that would haunt her forever. "He said I'm not real." Then she turned and walked to her small bedroom, closing the door so softly it broke Mrs. Chen's heart. Inside that room, something strange happened. The air shimmered faintly. Drawings taped to the walls fluttered even though no breeze stirred the curtains. Colors bled slightly as though the world itself felt her sorrow. Haley sat on her bed, pulling her knees to her chest, and whispered, "Why doesn't he want me?" Her little heart didn't know about business or reputation or pride. She only knew what love felt like when it was present, and what its absence felt like when it was denied before the whole world. Across the city, another man was watching the same interview. Caspian Vale, Julian's oldest friend. They had met as boys. Julian, the ambitious dreamer with impossible goals. Caspian, the artist with a heart too big for his own good. Their paths had diverged, one choosing profit, the other passion, but some bonds never fully broke. Tonight, however, something inside Caspian cracked wide open. He had been there the day Helly was born. He had held her, small and perfect, while Julian stood in the hallway making phone calls about stock prices. Caspian had seen the light in that little girl's eyes, pure and unfiltered, the kind that could melt the hardest cynic. Watching Julian now, lying to millions, denying the child who bore his eyes and his smile, Caspian felt disgust and pity wage war in his chest. Then his phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen. Her voice shook as she explained what had happened, that Haley had watched the interview, that she had locked herself in her room, that the air around her felt charged and unnatural. Caspian didn't hesitate. "I'm coming," he said, already grabbing his jacket. He drove faster than he should have through the sleeping city. the skyline flashing past like a cruel reminder of how far Julian had fallen from grace. When he arrived, Mrs. Chen's face was pale with worry. The apartment felt heavy, as though grief had a physical weight. The drawings on the walls moved faintly, shifting like living things. Caspian knelt outside Helly's door. "Hey, Helly," he said gently. "It's Uncle Caspian. Can I come in?" For a long moment there was no sound. Then came a whisper so soft it barely carried through the wood. "He said I'm not real." Caspian's chest tightened. "He was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the most real thing in the whole world, sweetheart." The door opened. The little girl stood there, her face streaked with tears, her pajamas covered in tiny stars. A faint golden light shimmered around her, barely visible but enough to make Caspian's breath catch. She looked up at him, trembling. "Uncle Caspian, if I was a mistake, can mistakes make things come alive?" He didn't understand at first, until he noticed one of her drawings on the wall behind her. A butterfly drawn in bright crayon, fluttering its wings softly. For a moment he thought exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but no, the wings moved. The air shimmered. Reality bent. Haley had always been special. Now her pain was rewriting the rules of what was possible. Caspian gathered her into his arms and held her tight as she cried into his shoulder. "You are not a mistake," he whispered fiercely. "You are a miracle." That night he made a decision that would change every life it touched. He left Julian a message, cold, controlled, but seething underneath. "I'm taking her with me," he said. "She deserves better than to be hidden like a shameful secret. You denied your daughter, Julian. You denied the best part of yourself. I'm taking her where she'll be loved and safe. If you ever decide to be a father, you know where to find us, but you'd better come ready to face what you've done." When Caspian hung up, he turned back to Helly, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her small hand clutching his sleeve. He lifted her gently, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her out to his old truck. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror as they drove toward the countryside. In the back seat, the child stirred once, murmuring something about butterflies. Caspian smiled sadly. "We'll find them," he whispered. "We'll find your butterflies." By the time dawn painted the sky in soft rose and gold, they arrived at his farmhouse. The place was old but alive, filled with sculptures, half-finished paintings, and the smell of clay and wood smoke. He carried her upstairs, tucked her into the guest bed, and stood by the window for a long time watching the sunrise. "Julian," he murmured to the empty air, "you just threw away the only thing that ever made you human." Downstairs, he poured himself coffee and stared at his phone, waiting for a call that never came. In the city, Julian Brenner was being celebrated for another perfect interview. Investors were ecstatic. Stocks rose. The headlines the next morning called him a master of control. He smiled for cameras, shook hands, gave statements, but every so often, when the flashes went off, something flickered behind his eyes. A shadow, a tremor of regret that he refused to name. But beneath all that success, something had already begun to crumble. Morning arrived like a soft awakening, sunlight spilling through the gauzy curtains of the farmhouse and painting golden patterns across the wooden floorboards. The air smelled of coffee, dew, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers from the garden outside. It was the kind of morning that carried no sound of the city. No horns, no static, no hurried footsteps. Only the slow rhythm of the countryside breathing in peace. In that tranquil space, a little girl stirred in her bed, half dreaming of colors that danced and whispered to her, of butterflies with paper wings that had once hung on apartment walls now fluttering free through the open fields of her imagination. When Helifera opened her eyes, it took her a moment to remember where she was. The walls were not the plain beige of her old room, but painted in soft sage green, with wooden beams crossing overhead like protective arms. A tray of breakfast, pancakes, strawberries, and a small glass of milk rested nearby, and beside it sat a neatly folded note written in an elegant looping hand. "Good morning, sunshine. You are safe here." She read the note again and again, tracing the words with her small finger as though afraid they might vanish. Then she heard footsteps outside, slow and gentle, and the door opened to reveal a woman with warm brown skin and dark curls tied up in a colorful scarf. Her smile was like sunlight that could melt away even the heaviest fears. "Good morning, sweetheart," the woman said softly. "I'm Nora. Caspian told me all about you. Well, not all about you, because I think he's still learning too, but enough to know that you're very special." She set the tray on the bedside table and perched carefully on the edge of the bed. Not too close, not too far, giving the little girl space to feel safe. Did you sleep well? Helifera nodded hesitantly, her voice still a whisper. I dreamed of butterflies. They were real this time. Not drawings. They flew over the hills. Nora's eyes softened. That sounds beautiful. I think the butterflies came to welcome you. She paused as though weighing something. Would you like to see the garden after breakfast? It's a bit wild, but I think it's been waiting for someone exactly like you. That invitation was gentle but powerful. It carried no pressure, no pity, only possibility. Helifera felt something she hadn't in a long time. Curiosity. After breakfast, Nora led her downstairs where Caspian was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair mussed, clay still under his fingernails. He was sculpting something on the counter while humming a tune that sounded old and peaceful. When he looked up and saw Haley, his face broke into a smile so genuine it made her heart ache. Morning, superstar, he said. Did the countryside treat you kindly? She nodded shyly and he grinned wider. Good, because it's yours now too. Come on, I have something to show you. Outside, the world unfolded like a painting too big for any frame. The farmhouse sat in the middle of rolling meadows dotted with daisies and clover. The air hummed with bees, and the sky stretched so wide and blue that it almost made Haley dizzy to look at it. The garden itself was a wild symphony of color. Roses climbing trellises, ivy crawling up the stone walls, and an ancient oak tree that stood like a silent guardian at the far end of the yard. From one of its low branches hung a wooden swing, creaking softly in the breeze. That swing's been lonely, Caspian said, nodding toward it. Think you can fix that? Helifera hesitated, then walked toward it, her small shoes crunching on the gravel path. When she sat and pushed off gently, the movement made her laugh, a small surprise sound that caught even her off guard. For weeks, laughter had felt like something that belonged to other children, but here in this wide-open world that smelled of earth and promise, it returned. Nora and Caspian exchanged a glance, one that said more than words could. Healing had begun, even if it was fragile. Over the next few days, the farmhouse became a rhythm of simple human things Helifera had never known in her short, strange life. Nora taught her how to knead bread, their hands dusted in flour as the air filled with the comforting scent of baking. Caspian introduced her to his studio, a converted barn filled with sculptures in every stage of creation. Clay figures half-formed, metal frames waiting for inspiration, marble shapes emerging from stone like dreams taking solid shape. This, he said one afternoon, gesturing around him, is where mistakes become art. She frowned at that. Mistakes? He smiled, kneeling beside her. Every sculpture begins as a mistake, a lump of clay with no shape. But you keep going. You keep trusting your hands until you see what was always hidden inside. Something in those words sank deep into her. For the first time, she began to wonder if maybe she wasn't a mistake either. Maybe she was something waiting to take shape, but there were still nights when she cried quietly. The farmhouse creaked softly under moonlight, and she would stare out the window at the stars, whispering questions to the father, who had turned her into a ghost in front of the world. Do you think he remembers me? She asked once, her small voice drifting into the dark where Caspian stood by the door. He didn't answer right away. He came in, sat beside her, and said, I think he's afraid to remember you. But fear doesn't last forever, Helly. Truth always finds its way back. She looked at him, her green eyes luminous in the dark. Do you hate him? Caspian sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. I hate what he did. But I don't hate him, because hate doesn't heal, and one day when he's ready, he'll have to face what he lost. Days became weeks. Helifera began to draw again. But something was different now. Her drawings seemed to breathe. When she sketched a bird, she could swear she heard its wings rustle faintly. When she drew a stream, she could almost smell the water. Nora would find her sitting in the garden for hours, her small hands stained with color, her eyes glowing faintly with concentration. She draws like she's remembering something from another world, Nora whispered once to Caspian, watching from the porch. He nodded slowly. Maybe she is. Maybe we all forget how powerful imagination really is until someone reminds us. One evening, as a summer storm rolled in, Caspian found Healy in his studio, standing before one of his unfinished sculptures, a marble figure of a woman with her arms outstretched toward the sky. The light flickered, Thunder murmured in the distance, and for a brief moment Caspian thought he saw the marble shimmer faintly. "Helly?" he asked carefully. She turned, startled. "I didn't mean to. I was just wishing she could dance." She looked sad. Caspian knelt in front of her, his expression gentle but serious. "You don't have to hide it from me. What you have, it's beautiful. But you have to be careful. Art can bring joy, but it can also carry pain if the heart behind it is hurting." She nodded, eyes wide, understanding more than he expected. And he realized that the child wasn't simply gifted, she was something extraordinary. The line between imagination and creation blurred within her, a secret the world was not ready to understand. Meanwhile, miles away, Julian Brenner sat in his penthouse surrounded by luxury and silence. His company's value had never been higher. His face adorned every magazine cover, yet the world around him felt hollow. Vivian's laughter rang false, his father's praise sounded cold, and every night when the lights dimmed he would see the echo of a small face in his mind. Green eyes, honey-colored hair, the ghost of a smile he had banished. He told himself he had done what was necessary, what any man of power must do to protect his empire. But deep inside, a whisper persisted. "You said she wasn't real." That whisper grew louder with every passing day. In the countryside, Halifra began to change. The quiet sadness that had once surrounded her softened into something radiant. She filled the walls of Caspian's studio with drawings of life, flowers blooming, rivers flowing, creatures that had never existed but somehow seemed as real as anything else. The house became brighter because of her, as if her imagination painted the air itself. Nora often said the place had found its missing heartbeat. Caspian only smiled and said, "No, it found its light." One night, under a canopy of stars, Caspian took Helly by the hand and led her to the oak tree. Hanging from its lowest branch was a new swing, larger, sturdier, carved with little patterns of butterflies and suns. "I made this for you," he said softly, "because I want you to remember something. The world might try to define who you are, but only you can decide what's true." Helly looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "But what if people don't believe me?" He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then you show them. Not by fighting, not by shouting, but by being so real, so alive that they can't help but see you." The stars reflected in her eyes like promises. She sat on the swing, and as Caspian pushed her, the world seemed to shimmer again, the wind carrying laughter that sounded like hope itself. For the first time since that terrible night on television, Helifera felt something stir deep inside her, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't a secret anymore and far away, in a sterile penthouse filled with the sound of emptiness. Julian Brenner woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the echo of a child's laughter in his dreams. He didn't know why. But he knew that something inside him had just shifted, something that would soon drive him to search for the truth he had buried. The city glittered beneath a curtain of rain. From the penthouse that crowned one of its tallest towers, Julian Brenner watched lightning crawl silently across the distant skyline. The sound of the storm was muted by glass, but its reflection flashed across his face, lighting the exhaustion etched into his features. Weeks had passed since that interview, the one that had cemented his reputation as the unshakable genius of modern technology, the visionary who could charm markets with a smile. His company's stock had surged. Investors adored him. Every magazine cover sang the same hymn of triumph. Yet none of it felt real anymore. Every congratulatory handshake, every toast in his honor, every photo taken beneath flashing cameras only deepened the emptiness inside him. The lie he had spoken to millions hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. It followed him into meetings, haunted his reflections, echoed in the quiet spaces between applause. He told himself he had done what was necessary. That image was everything in business, that he had protected his company and his family's legacy. But in the dark hours of the night when no one was watching, he could no longer escape the truth. He had not saved anything. He had lost everything that mattered. He dreamed of her more often now, a small girl with sunlight hair and eyes like green glass, standing in a field he didn't recognize. In his dreams, she never spoke, but she looked at him with a sadness so deep it stole the air from his lungs. Sometimes she held out her hand. Other times she turned away as if fading into mist. Each time he woke, drenched in sweat, the sound of her voice, soft and trembling, echoing from the corners of his mind. He said, "I'm not real." Those words clawed at him, ripping through the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. In the morning, he would bury the feeling under work, under deals and deadlines, under the sterile hum of boardrooms and strategy calls. But feelings have a way of seeping through even the strongest walls, and guilt is a patient intruder. Vivian noticed the change first. The glamorous socialite who had once fit so perfectly beside him now found his silence unbearable. She had loved the version of Julian who was untouchable, composed, magnetic. But this new Julian, distracted, withdrawn, haunted, was something she couldn't comprehend. "You need to stop brooding," she snapped one evening as they sat in the living room surrounded by designer perfection. "People can sense weakness. If the media ever digs deeper into that child nonsense, you'll ruin yourself. You should thank me for insisting you deny it." Her words should have comforted him. Instead, they made him sick. He looked at her, at the flawless hair, the perfect smile, the emptiness behind her eyes, and realized he didn't even know who she was anymore. Or maybe, he thought bitterly, she had always been this way, and he had simply been too blinded by ambition to notice. That night, he went to his study, poured himself a drink he didn't touch, and sat before the massive window overlooking the city he had conquered. Beneath that glittering empire, somewhere beyond the towers and lights, was a child who bore his name in secret. A child who had watched her father erase her before the world. He wondered what she looked like now. Did she still draw? Did she still laugh? Did she still wait for him to come home even though he never did? The questions gnawed at him until he could no longer sit still. He opened a locked drawer, took out an old photograph, one he hadn't looked at in years. It showed a baby wrapped in a pink blanket sleeping peacefully. He remembered that day vividly. The smell of antiseptic in the hospital, the sound of her first cry, the way her tiny hand had gripped his finger with surprising strength. He remembered thinking, this is what real creation feels like. Not technology, not money, life. And then he had buried that feeling under board meetings, under ambition, under fear. He pressed the photograph against his forehead, whispering, "What have I done?" Meanwhile, far from the glittering towers, the countryside breathed in its own rhythm, slow, patient, eternal. The farmhouse where Helifera lived with Caspian and Nora had become a sanctuary of gentle miracles. Summer ripened around them, bringing long days filled with the scent of earth and rain. Heli had grown taller, stronger, her laughter ringing through the fields like wind chimes. She spent her mornings in the garden, painting and sketching, her imagination spilling into the world around her. The line between dream and reality continued to blur in subtle ways that both awed and unsettled Caspian. He would watch her sitting in the grass drawing a flock of birds, and moments later, a real flock would pass overhead, their formation mirroring her sketch almost perfectly. Sometimes the flowers she painted would bloom out of season. Sometimes the wind itself seemed to follow the rhythm of her thoughts. She didn't boast about these things. She didn't even question them. To her, it was simply how the world worked, a place where feelings had color and imagination had weight. Caspian kept a journal of it all, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps part of him feared what it might mean, that the child's gift was something beyond his understanding, something beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Yet more than fear, he felt reverence. "She creates with love," Nora said one evening as they watched Heli chase fireflies near the oak tree. "The world responds to that. Maybe love is the oldest kind of magic." Caspian smiled at that, but he couldn't help thinking of Julian. He wondered if the man who had once been his brother in all but blood would ever find his way back to the daughter he had forsaken. And if he did, what would happen when he saw what she had become? The answer came sooner than he expected. In the city, Julian's quiet unraveling began to bleed into his work. He missed deadlines, snapped at executives, forgot important meetings. His father, Theodore Brenner, summoned him one afternoon to the family estate, a marble fortress that smelled of old money and control. "You're slipping," the old man said without preamble. "The board is concerned. Whatever personal weakness has infected you, end it now." Julian's jaw clenched. "It's not weakness," he said through gritted teeth. "It's conscience." The word tasted foreign in that house. His father's eyes narrowed, sharp and cold. "Conscience doesn't build empires. Control does. You've forgotten who you are." Julian stood, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "No. I'm remembering who I was before I let you turn me into this." He left the estate before his father could reply. the photograph of Halifera burning like a brand in his pocket. That night, for the first time in years, Julian drove without a destination. The rain returned, washing the city in silver streaks. He passed the streets he had once called home, the old neighborhoods, the places that still smelled faintly of simpler times. Finally, without fully understanding why, he found himself parked outside an old apartment building, the one he had rented years ago for Mrs. Chen and the child. His hands shook as he climbed the stairs. The door was still there, but the nameplate was gone. When an elderly neighbor answered his knock, she looked at him with faint recognition. "You're that man," she said, frowning. "The one from the TV?" His throat tightened. "The woman who lived here, Mrs. Chen, is she still here?" The neighbor shook her head. "Moved out months ago. Some artist fellow took the little girl, kind man. Lives out near the countryside, I think. Haven't seen them since." Julian's heart stuttered. Caspian, of course. It could only be him. The realization hit like a thunderclap. His best friend had taken the child he'd abandoned. For a long moment, Julian stood in the hallway, frozen between shame and relief. Then, for the first time since the night of the interview, he felt something that resembled purpose. He had to find them. Not to reclaim, not to control, but to atone. The journey to the countryside took hours, but it felt both endless and inevitable. As the city lights faded behind him, Julian felt each mile strip away a layer of his former life. The glass towers gave way to fields, the hum of traffic to the whisper of wind. When he finally reached the gravel road that led to Caspian's farmhouse, the sun was setting, turning the horizon into molten gold. He parked at the gate, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor him against the tide of emotion threatening to break loose. Through the window, he saw the house, bathed in evening light, and a small figure running through the garden. Her laughter clear, ringing like music. His chest tightened painfully. He couldn't move. He sat there, tears he didn't deserve stinging his eyes, watching the life that could have been his, watching the child he had denied playing in the light of another man's love. Halifera didn't see him that day, but she felt something, a presence, a shift in the air. Later, when she sat on her bed sketching the sunset, her crayons faltered. The orange streak she drew across the paper darkened suddenly, turning almost crimson. She frowned. "What is that?" Nora asked from the doorway. Helly looked up, her voice small. "A shadow that doesn't know where it belongs." Caspian watched her from the porch that night, sensing the change. The wind carried a different kind of silence, the kind that comes before something inevitable. He glanced toward the distant road where a pair of headlights had once flickered and disappeared, and he knew without being told that the past was coming for them all. In the city, Julian returned to his penthouse, but nothing felt the same. The glass walls seemed colder, the view emptier. He stood by the window until dawn, the photograph still in his hand, and whispered a promise into the quiet. "I'm coming for you, my little girl. Not to own you, not to use you, just to tell you that you're real." And in that moment, something strange happened. A single butterfly, pale gold, luminous as sunlight, appeared on the other side of the glass, hovering there against the stormy dawn. Julian's breath caught. He pressed his palm to the window, and for a brief instant, it felt like the world itself had heard him. Miles away, as the first light touched the farmhouse, Halifera opened her eyes and smiled faintly. A butterfly had landed on her windowsill, golden and trembling, as though it had flown a very long way just to find her. The road to redemption is never loud. It does not announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It whispers quietly, through the cracks of a heart that has finally grown tired of pretending. The drive to Caspian's farmhouse was long and winding, cutting through endless stretches of countryside bathed in early morning mist. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the sky wore the pale hue of silver dawn. Julian Brenner gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had driven these roads before years ago, when ambition was still young and friendship was still pure, when he and Caspian had dreamed about building things that mattered, not just companies or fortunes, but legacies. Back then, the world had felt vast and kind. Now it felt like an open wound. As the farmhouse came into view, nestled between sprawling fields of gold and green, Julian's chest tightened. The place looked like something out of a memory he didn't deserve. Peaceful, untouched by the noise of the city, alive in ways his world had forgotten to be. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and the faint sound of laughter drifted through the cool air. He parked the car by the gate and turned off the engine, sitting there for a long moment as his heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He wasn't ready to face what waited beyond that gate, but some moments in life are not about readiness, they are about courage. He stepped out of the car. The crunch of gravel beneath his shoes echoed in the quiet morning. The farmhouse stood steady and warm against the horizon, every brick and beam radiating the kind of comfort that money could never build. As he approached the gate, his hands trembled. He hadn't felt this uncertain since he was a boy standing before his father's study, rehearsing apologies that were never accepted. This time the fear was worse because it wasn't pride on the line, it was love, and the knowledge that he had thrown it away. He walked up the stone path slowly, like a man stepping through the wreckage of his own mistakes. The garden was alive with color. Wild roses climbed the fences. Lavender brushed his hands as he passed, and wind chimes sang softly from the porch. Then he heard it, the laughter. Small, bright, clear. It hit him like sunlight through storm clouds. He turned and saw her. Halifera was sitting beneath the great oak tree, sketchbook on her lap, her honey-colored hair glinting in the morning light. Caspian knelt beside her, showing her how to shape something with clay, his hands guiding hers. Nora was nearby, hanging laundry on a line that swayed in the breeze. The scene was so painfully beautiful that Julian's breath caught in his throat. He didn't belong in that picture, not anymore. He was an intruder in the life he should have cherished. For a long moment he simply watched. Every heartbeat was a reminder of what his pride had cost. He took a step forward, and the crunch of gravel made Caspian look up. Their eyes met. Time didn't stop, it shattered. Years of friendship, betrayal, and silence collided in that single glance. Caspian's expression was unreadable, a mixture of shock, anger, and something else, something almost like sorrow. He stood slowly, placing himself instinctively between Julian and the little girl. Julian. The name came out like a stone falling into still water, soft but heavy. Julian swallowed hard. "Caspian," he said, his voice barely steady. "I don't," Caspian cut in quietly. "Not yet. Not here." He turned to Nora, who had frozen mid-motion, and gave her a subtle nod. She understood. With gentle calm, she walked to Halifera and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "why don't you take your sketchbook to the garden by the fountain? I want to show you something later." Helly looked up, curious. Her green eyes, the same shade Julian saw every time he closed his own, met his for the briefest moment. She didn't recognize him. Not really, but something inside her seemed to pause, as though the air itself whispered that this man was part of a story she had once heard in dreams. Then she smiled politely, the kind of shy smile children give strangers, and ran off toward the garden. Julian stood frozen, watching her go, his heart twisting until he thought it might break. When she disappeared around the corner, Caspian finally spoke. "You shouldn't have come." "I know," Julian said quietly. "But I had to." Caspian crossed his arms, the set of his shoulders hard. "You had to? You had to deny her on national television too, didn't you? You had to erase her because your father and your investors might think she was an inconvenience. You had to look into the camera and say your daughter wasn't real." Julian flinched at the words. "I made a mistake." Caspian's laugh was bitter. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday, Julian. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was cowardice dressed up as strategy." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Julian looked down, unable to meet his friend's gaze. "You're right," he said finally. "I was a coward. I was every terrible thing you think I am. But I'm here now because I can't keep living with what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need to see her, to tell her the truth." Caspian studied him for a long moment. The artist in him could read truth the way others read color, and in Julian's eyes he saw no manipulation. Only regret so deep it had hollowed the man out from the inside. Still, trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in an afternoon. "You don't get to walk in here and fix everything with an apology," Caspian said finally, his voice low but steady. "You don't get to undo years of silence because your conscience woke up. That little girl has a life now, a good one. She's happy. She's safe. She's not a secret anymore, and I won't let you break her again." Julian nodded, the sting of those words landing like deserved punishment. "I understand. I don't deserve to be her father, but I need her to know that I see her, that she's real to me now." The wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of clay and lavender. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Caspian sighed and rubbed his temple. She's in the garden. If you go to her, you keep it simple. No promises, no explanations she can't understand. You tell her what's true and nothing more. If I see one tear fall from her eyes because of you, I swear to God, Julian, I'll make sure you never see her again. Julian nodded. Fair. He walked toward the garden slowly, his feet heavy as stone. Every step felt like crossing into another world, a place built from gentleness, not greed. The sound of the fountain reached him first, the soft trickle of water blending with birdsong. Then he saw her again, sitting on a stone bench surrounded by flowers, her small hand moving over her sketchbook. She didn't notice him at first. He stood there, afraid to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice came out softer than he intended. You draw beautifully. Halifra turned, startled but not afraid. Thank you, she said politely. Uncle Caspian says I draw the world the way I want it to be. Julian smiled faintly. He's right. She tilted her head, studying him with curious eyes. Do I know you? The question broke something in him. He knelt down so he wouldn't tower over her, his voice trembling. Not really, but I knew you once when you were very small. She looked puzzled, then glanced down at her drawing, a butterfly with glowing wings. You're crying, she said softly. He hadn't realized he was. He wiped his eyes quickly and tried to smile. I guess I am. You remind me of someone very special. Her gaze softened with the kind of compassion that only children possess. Then you should tell them you miss them. People need to hear that. Julian's throat tightened. You're right. I should. Before he could say more, a soft glow filled the air around them. The butterfly on her page shimmered and then, impossibly, lifted off the paper, its wings radiant in the sunlight. Julian stared, stunned as it circled them once before flying into the open sky. Halifra laughed, clapping her hands. See, it happens sometimes. Uncle Caspian says it's my imagination being too loud. Julian could barely speak. It's beautiful, she grinned. I think it's because when I draw with love, the world listens. He swallowed hard. Then the world must love you very much. Before she could answer, Caspian's voice called from across the garden. Hallie, come inside, sweetheart. Breakfast. She hopped up, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. Bye, mister, she said brightly, running toward the house. Julian watched her go until she disappeared inside. He stood there, rooted in place, overwhelmed by the realization that his daughter had become something far beyond his understanding, an embodiment of innocence and creation, untainted by the greed that had consumed him. Caspian joined him quietly, his expression softer now. She doesn't remember me, Julian said hoarsely. Caspian shook his head. She remembers what matters. Kindness, warmth. Those are the things that stick. Julian looked toward the house where laughter spilled from the open windows. I ruined everything. Caspian's voice was calm but not unkind. You can't change what's done, but you can decide what comes next. Julian turned to him, eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. Will you let me try? Caspian studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded once. You can come back tomorrow. Help her in the garden. No big conversations, no heavy words. Just be there. If you can do that, maybe she'll find her own way to you. Julian exhaled, the tension in his shoulders breaking into something like gratitude. Thank you, Caspian. Don't thank me, Caspian said, his voice low. Thank her. She's the one teaching us how to forgive. As the sun rose higher over the fields, Julian stood there in the garden long after Caspian had gone inside, the scent of wildflowers surrounding him, the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the open air. For the first time in years, he felt something new, something fragile but powerful. Hope. And in that moment, he understood that redemption wasn't a grand gesture or a public confession. It was this, standing quietly in the light of the truth, willing to rebuild one small moment at a time. The wind rustled through the trees, and a golden butterfly landed briefly on his shoulder before taking flight again. Julian watched it go, his heart finally beginning to thaw. The days that followed unfolded with a stillness that felt both foreign and healing. The countryside seemed to breathe differently now, as though the air itself sensed that something long broken was quietly being mended. Each morning Julian returned to the farmhouse, not as the titan of industry the world knew, but as a humbled man with dirt on his shoes and hesitation in his step. The first day he came back, Helifera greeted him with cautious curiosity, the kind children reserve for strangers who feel somehow familiar. Caspian kept a watchful eye from the porch, and Nora, ever gentle, treated the moment as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There were no grand introductions, no rehearsed speeches. Julian simply knelt beside the little girl in the garden, picked up a trowel, and began helping her plant marigold seeds. At first she said nothing, only occasionally glancing at him from beneath the brim of her straw hat, studying the lines of his face the way she might study a cloud, trying to decide what shape it wanted to be. Then, as days turned into a quiet rhythm, the silence between them softened into something alive. Julian discovered that redemption wasn't found in apologies or explanations. It lived in small consistencies. It was in showing up before sunrise to water the flowers because she liked how the light caught the dew. It was in sitting beside her as she drew, resisting the urge to speak so she could fill the air with her imagination instead of his remorse. It was in listening when she told him about her made-up creatures that lived under the oak tree, nodding with the solemn sincerity only a true listener gives to a child. With every gentle morning, with every soft smile that flickered across her face, he felt the weight of years begin to lift from his chest. And though she still didn't call him anything but Mr. Julian, he cherished every syllable she spoke to him as if it were grace itself. Caspian watched from a careful distance. He saw the way Julian's hands, once accustomed to sleek glass tablets and contracts, had learned the rough, honest texture of soil. He saw how the man who used to measure success in stock prices now measured it in laughter. But trust, Caspian knew, is not a door you can simply knock on until it opens. It is a seed that must be watered by patience. Some nights after Helifera had gone to bed, the two men would sit on the porch in silence, the darkness between them filled with the ghosts of their shared past. Eventually words would come. "I thought power meant control," Julian confessed one evening, his voice thick with regret. "I thought love was something I could manage the same way I managed everything else. Clean, contained, predictable. I didn't realize it's the one thing that demands surrender." Caspian nodded slowly, his gaze on the horizon. "Love doesn't want perfection," he said. "It wants presence. You're learning that now." The learning was slow and not without its thorns. There were days when Helifera pulled away, suddenly quiet, caught between trust and confusion. Sometimes she would ask questions that twisted knives in his heart, innocent, direct questions that no business negotiation could prepare him for. "Why did you go away?" she asked one afternoon, her voice barely above the hum of bees around the sunflowers. Julian knelt beside her, his hands trembling in the soil. "Because I was afraid," he said honestly. "Afraid of what people would think. Afraid of losing what I thought mattered. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." She studied him with those luminous eyes that seemed to see through everything false. "Uncle Caspian says fear makes people small," she said after a moment. "But you're taller than him, so maybe you're getting bigger again." Her words, simple and pure, broke him open. He smiled through the tears that came uninvited. "Maybe I am," he whispered. The summer deepened, the fields turned gold, and the rhythm of the farmhouse settled into something sacred. Julian began to sculpt again under Caspian's quiet guidance. The clay felt strange at first, uncooperative, but eventually it yielded to his hands. He found in art the honesty he had lost in business, the way mistakes could be shaped into beauty, the way form emerged from patience. He sculpted not for galleries or investors, but for himself, for the child who had once drawn butterflies on apartment walls, for the father who had buried his heart under ambition. Slowly, under his fingers, a figure emerged, a child holding a butterfly cupped in her palms, her expression filled with wonder and light. When it was finished, Caspian said nothing. He simply placed a hand on Julian's shoulder and nodded. The gesture said everything words could not. Helifera saw the sculpture later that evening. She traced its contours with her small hands, eyes wide. "She's pretty," she said softly. "She looks like she's holding something gentle." Julian knelt beside her. "She is," he said. "She's holding the moment before forgiveness." The girl looked at him, brow furrowed. "Forgiveness?" He hesitated. "It's when someone stops being angry and starts remembering love instead." She thought about that for a long time, then whispered, "I think the world forgave you already." Her words settled over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night, as twilight bled across the fields and the first stars appeared, Something extraordinary happened, quiet, simple, yet profound. Helifera came to him in the garden carrying her sketchbook. "Mr. Julian," she said, shy but certain, "can I draw with you?" He nodded, his heart pounding. They sat side by side beneath the old oak, the air alive with crickets and the scent of wild mint. She opened her book to a blank page, handed him a colored pencil, and began to draw. He followed her lead, unsure, clumsy, but willing. Together they filled the page with a landscape of impossible beauty. Mountains shaped like laughter, rivers made of memory, a sky bursting with butterflies. When they finished, the drawing shimmered faintly, as if light itself approved. Helifera looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I call you Dad now?" The word hit him with the force of mercy. He couldn't speak. He simply nodded, tears spilling freely, his arms wrapping around her in a silence deeper than any vow. The world seemed to hold its breath as they embraced, and somewhere beyond time, forgiveness became real. From that day forward, everything changed, not in dramatic flashes but in quiet continuities. Julian didn't move back to the city. The empire he had built could function without him. The daughter he had once denied could not. He sold his penthouse, donated half his fortune to build art and science programs for children, and used the rest to buy the neighboring field where wildflowers grew unchecked. Together with Caspian and Nora, he helped turn it into a sanctuary, a place for healing, for creation, for second chances. People began to call it Helifera's Haven, though the child herself insisted it belonged to everyone. She painted murals on the walls, each one alive with color and joy, and sometimes, when the light hit just right, the butterflies in those paintings seemed to tremble their wings, as though remembering that love could indeed make the world move. Years later, when reporters came looking for Julian Brenner, the man who had once ruled the tech world and then vanished, they found instead a quiet sculptor who smiled more than he spoke, who told them that true innovation wasn't measured in patents or profits, but in the courage to start over. "I used to think the world needed my brilliance," he told one young journalist. "Now I know it just needed my heart." Behind him in the garden, Helifera laughed as she chased real butterflies across the field, her voice a song that carried on the wind. Caspian and Nora watched from the porch, content. The sun dipped low, painting everything gold, and for a brief, perfect moment, all the years of pain and pride and loss dissolved into the simple miracle of a father and daughter sharing the same sky. As evening deepened, Julian stood beneath the oak tree and looked toward the horizon. The field shimmered, the sculptures caught the last of the light, and he felt for the first time completely whole. Redemption, he realized, was never about erasing what had been done. It was about becoming the person who could finally face it, hold it, and still choose love. The wind rose softly through the leaves, carrying laughter, carrying peace, carrying the quiet truth that some miracles are not sudden. They are grown, day by human hands willing to try again. And in that fading light, as Helifera's golden butterfly fluttered past him into the glowing dusk, Julian Brenner closed his eyes and whispered the only prayer that ever mattered. "Thank you."